Welcome to another deep dive, and this one is gonna get spooky. We're talking vampires. Well, not exactly the Dracula types you might be thinking of, but a time when the belief in vampires was, well, a terrifying reality.
Right. People weren't just enjoying vampire stories around a campfire. This was serious stuff.
Absolutely. We're gonna delve into the largest vampire epidemic in history, an actual epidemic.
And you might be surprised to learn that it wasn't just some small, isolated thing. This epidemic spread like wildfire through Central Europe back in the 18th century.
Yeah.
And we're talking decades, not just a couple of years.
Decades. Wow. So to get to the bottom of this, we've got some fascinating sources lined up. We've got the Guinness World Records article on vampire epidemics, some background from good old Wikipedia on vampire folklore, and I even found this interesting snippet about an interesting news source, actually. But before we get ahead of ourselves, what do you think is the most compelling thing about this whole thing, knowing what we're about to, dive into?
Well, for me, it's the fact that the word vampire, the English word vampire, actually popped up during this time, the 18th century.
Really?
Yeah, shows you just how seriously people were taking this whole vampire thing. They needed a word for it.
It's like the word was born out of necessity, like it wasn't just a myth, it was something people really needed a word for. Wow.
Exactly. Now, let's try to picture 18th century Europe, especially Central Europe. Tons of small villages. Life was pretty harsh back then. Disease was everywhere.
Yeah.
And of course, science wasn't exactly what it is today.
Right, so death was a much more, I guess you could say, a much more common reality.
Absolutely. And without the scientific knowledge that we take for granted today, people were grasping at straws, trying to find any explanation for the stuff they just couldn't explain.
Makes sense. They needed something to make sense of the unexplainable.
And that's where vampires come in. It wasn't just a spooky tale. It was a genuine fear for these villagers. The Guinness World Records article even calls this period the biggest vampire epidemic in history, lasting from, get this, the 1720s to the 1750s.
Wow, decades. That's a long time for this fear to grip a community. What do you think made this time period so ripe for this kind of widespread panic?
Well, there were probably some anxieties already simmering beneath the surface, maybe about disease or, social upheaval, that kind of thing. Things that could easily amplify fear.
So you're saying there was like a kind of foundation of fear already there?
Exactly. And then you add in some specific cases that acted as catalysts, like throwing gasoline on a fire.
Right.
And that's when the panic really took off.
Like those cases of Peter Blagojevich and Arnold Pale, they're kind of like the poster children for this whole vampire epidemic, right?
Spot on. These weren't just rumors or whispers. They were documented cases with real people involved, real fear attached to them.
Okay, let's start with Blagojevich. He was a Serbian villager and he died in 1725. But then, that's when the story started.
Yeah, people started claiming they saw him walking around, even visiting his son to ask for food.
Whoa, that's creepy.
And get this, when his son refused, he died the very next day. It's a classic example of how fear can spread like wildfire through a community.
It's like a chain reaction of fear, almost like a virus itself. The Guinness World Records article says Blagojevich was blamed for 9 other deaths, all attributed to sudden illnesses and blood loss. It's hard to even imagine the terror in that village.
I bet it was palpable. So naturally, they decide to exhume his body.
And what did they find?
Exactly what they feared. His body was seemingly untouched by decay. They even saw what looked like fresh blood.
That's pretty disturbing, but looking back now, it seems like the lack of understanding about decomposition played a huge role in all of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Today, we know that bloating, blood seeping out, even the appearance of fresh skin, these are all normal parts of decomposition. But back then, it's easy to see how people would misinterpret those signs.
It really does seem like a recipe for misunderstanding.
Exactly.
So they staked Blagojevich and burned his body to try and stop this, this supposed curse. But then there's Arnold Pale, and his case really took the panic to a whole new level. He was a Serbian soldier who died in 1726 after, breaking his neck.
Pretty straightforward, right?
You'd think so. But within a month, 4 people who claimed Pale's spirit was tormenting them, they died. And when they exhumed his body, guess what? It appeared perfectly preserved. They even noted fresh blood, just like with Blagojevich.
It's incredible how a lack of understanding about basic biology, really basic stuff, could create this level of fear. Did it ever occur to them that maybe there were other explanations, like the smell, for instance? Wouldn't they have noticed the smell of decomposition? That's a great point. It seems that when fear takes over, Even our basic senses can be overridden.
Wow.
But there's another layer to this. Pale's case actually triggered not one, but two outbreaks of supposed vampirism. By 1731, 17 more deaths were blamed on him.
Wow, that's a lot. This wasn't just villagers panicking either. Even military doctors were brought in to investigate. What were they hoping to find?
Well, it seems they were trying to make sense of the unexplainable. Remember, they were working within the limitations of their time. They didn't have our understanding of decomposition or infectious diseases.
Right, they were trying to fit these events into their understanding of the world.
Exactly.
So these cases, Blagojevich and Pale, they weren't just local incidents. Their stories were spread far and wide, taking the vampire myth all across Europe.
Think about how information traveled back then. No internet, no social media. These stories were carried by word of mouth, through letters, travelers sharing tales. It's pretty amazing how stories, especially scary ones, could spread so quickly.
And those stories had real-world consequences. One story that really struck me, it's in the Guinness World Records article. It's about a young girl named Stanoska. She died in 1731 during that second outbreak linked to Paul. What's so sad is that she wasn't even physically attacked. She woke up screaming, totally convinced a vampire was trying to strangle her, and she died 3 days later, just from fear.
That's a powerful example of how strong the mind can be, especially when it's surrounded by fear.
It makes you think, how easily we can be swayed by what everyone around us believes. If everyone's convinced of something, it's hard not to get caught up in it, even if there's no real proof.
Absolutely. It highlights how beliefs can spread, sometimes even faster than actual viruses.
And speaking of viruses, we can't forget the role of real diseases in all of this. Tuberculosis was rampant in the 18th century, and a lot of its symptoms, things like paleness, weakness, coughing up blood, they lined up perfectly with what people thought were signs of vampirism.
It's like a real-life medical mystery, feeding into a supernatural narrative. And it wasn't just tuberculosis. Pellagra and rabies were around too, and some of their symptoms, like sensitivity to light or aggression, could easily be misinterpreted. Imagine seeing someone suffering from rabies without knowing what it was. You might think they were possessed or something.
It's like a horror movie waiting to happen. It makes you wonder if these vampire epidemics were, in a way, just outbreaks of misunderstood diseases.
It's definitely a compelling theory. But there's another layer to consider. Even with the limited science they had back then, some people were trying to offer natural explanations for these events.
So why weren't they listened to?
It seems like fear and superstition just drowned them out. People were primed to believe, and the vampire provided a convenient scapegoat for all their anxieties. And there's this document from 1728 that offers some insight into the mindset of the time.
You're talking about that treatise with the really long title, De Masticatione Mortorum in Tumulus. What was that all about?
Well, the title translates to On the Chewing of the Dead in Their Tombs. Basically, it describes some pretty creepy observations in graveyards. Things like corpses seemingly biting their shrouds or making gnawing sounds. You can imagine how that would feed the vampire hysteria.
It's definitely spooky stuff. But with hindsight, we can see how those observations, while strange, were probably just natural parts of decomposition. It's easy to connect those dots to vampires if you don't have the right knowledge.
Exactly. It was a perfect storm of fear, superstition, and misinterpretation. And this wasn't limited to Europe either. The fear of vampires causing disease even reached New England.
You mean the case of Mercy Brown? I've heard that name before.
Her story is really tragic. Mercy died of tuberculosis in 1892. And when other family members got sick, they suspected her of being a vampire.
Wow, 1892, that's pretty late for this kind of belief to still be around.
It shows how deeply ingrained these fears were. And what's even more tragic is what they did. They dug up her body, and because it wasn't as decomposed as they expected, they were convinced she was a vampire.
So what do they do?
They burned her heart and gave the ashes to her sick brother to drink, hoping it would cure him.
Wow, that's just, it really underscores how desperate people were for answers, for cures, and how that desperation could drive them to do things that seem unthinkable to us now. It really highlights the link between what we believe and what we do, how a powerful belief can make you act in ways you never imagined.
And that's the power of the vampire myth. It taps into a primal fear that transcends time and cultures.
And speaking of transcending time, that brings us to, well, I guess you could say the ultimate vampire figure, Vlad the Impaler.
Vlad III, the 15th century ruler of Wallachia. He wasn't a vampire in the traditional sense, but his story definitely contributed to the modern image of vampires.
Yeah, he was known for being incredibly brutal, impaling his enemies on stakes. hence the nickname.
Exactly. And it was his cruelty, his reputation for violence and bloodshed that gave Bram Stoker the inspiration for Dracula.
So Vlad the Impaler was the inspiration, but over time, vampires have gone from something people genuinely feared to a source of fascination in fiction.
That's a pretty interesting shift. They've gone from figures of dread to characters in novels, movies, TV shows. They're everywhere now, and they come in all forms: romantic, brooding, even comedic.
Quite a journey from real-life terror to pop culture icons. Makes you wonder, why are we still so drawn to these creatures of the night?
That's a question we'll explore further as we continue this deep dive. We'll unpack how the vampire myth reflects our changing anxieties and fascinations, and how it continues to resonate with us even today. It really is amazing how this figure, one born out of fear and misunderstanding, had become such a complex and lasting, cultural icon.
It is. And what's even more interesting is that the vampire myth didn't just vanish when science and medicine advanced. It actually changed, adapted to our anxieties and I guess you could say fascinations.
And that evolution, that's what makes vampires so interesting to study. It's like they're a mirror, reflecting our fears and desires as a culture. Take the vampire's thirst for blood, for example.
Right.
It's primal, it's visceral, and it taps into this deep-seated fear we have. Fear of being consumed, of losing control.
I get that. It's a pretty powerful image.
It is. And that fear has taken on different meanings throughout history. Back in the 18th century, it was the fear of disease, a direct threat to your physical well-being. But today, I think the vampire's thirst could be seen as a metaphor for something else, like addiction, maybe, or those insatiable desires that can consume us.
So you're saying the vampire is like a blank slate, something we can project our own fears and fascinations onto.
Exactly. And as our fears evolve, so does the vampire.
That's why we see so many different types of vampires in pop culture, right? You've got the romantic, brooding vampires from Twilight, and then you've got those terrifying creatures from Nosferatu. It's like each generation puts its own spin on the myth.
It's true. It's almost like we're constantly trying to understand the vampire, to figure out what it means to us. And each time we reinterpret it, we learn a little bit more about ourselves in the process.
I like that. It's like a never-ending exploration. And even today, in the 21st century, the vampire myth still has a certain allure. There are actual vampire subcultures, groups of people who are, they're fascinated by vampire lore, and they even adopt parts of the lifestyle, like drinking blood.
Right. It's important to recognize that these groups exist and that they represent a different way of engaging with the vampire myth.
Of course. And just to be clear, we're just reporting what our sources say. We're not endorsing any particular viewpoint here. But it is interesting from a sociological standpoint to see how a myth, a story, can have such a real impact on people's lives.
It shows the power of stories, of how they can shape our understanding of the world, even influence our actions. And it reminds us that the line between fiction and reality isn't always so clear, especially when you're dealing with something as powerful as the vampire myth.
It really does make you think, what other supernatural stuff might have real-world explanations that we're just missing? What myths are we still holding on to, even though science has come so far?
That's a great question. And it really highlights the importance of critical thinking, of always questioning what we see and hear, even when it seems fantastical or unbelievable.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this vampire epidemic, what are some of the key takeaways you hope our listeners, that they walk away with?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's important to remember that even the most incredible myths often have their roots in real events and anxieties.
Like the vampire epidemic, which was sparked by a lack of understanding about decomposition and disease.
Exactly. And secondly, I hope listeners will appreciate just how powerful stories are. They can shape our beliefs and actions, both for good and bad.
The vampire myth has gone from a figure of fear to a complex cultural icon, mirroring our evolving fears and fascinations.
And finally, I would encourage everyone to be curious and to think critically. Don't be afraid to question what you see and hear, to dig deeper, to search for the truth, even if it's buried under layers of myth and legend.
Well said. So to our listeners, as you head back out into the world, keep exploring, keep questioning, and remember, sometimes the most fascinating discoveries are right there in front of you, waiting to be found. It's funny, we started talking about vampire epidemics, and now we're talking about the power of stories and thinking critically. It's amazing how those ideas all weave together.
It is, isn't it? And that's what I love about these deep dives. We begin with something seemingly simple, vampires, right? But we end up exploring all these complex things about human history and psychology, and even like the nature of belief itself.
It's a good reminder that nothing is ever as simple as it seems. There's always more to uncover, more layers to peel back, and that's what makes, I think, learning so exciting.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that's a fantastic takeaway for our listeners. Don't just settle for like surface level explanations. Dig deeper, ask those questions, challenge those assumptions. You never know what you might find.
It's like we've given our listeners a toolbox, a curiosity toolkit to take with them as they go out and explore the world. Who knows what mysteries they might solve with it?
Maybe they'll uncover the real-world explanations behind other supernatural phenomena. Or maybe they'll find hidden truths in the stories and narratives that shape how we understand the world around us.
The possibilities are endless. But for now, it's time to wrap up our deep dive. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? From the terror of those vampire epidemics to the enduring fascination with these creatures of the night.
It has been. And I really hope our listeners found it as thought-provoking as I have. Remember, the world is full of mysteries. But if you're curious and willing to question things, well, you can unlock some incredible insights.
Well said. So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and never stop diving deep.